Hey everyone, welcome to our panel about making commercial indie games as a professor. Woohoo! In this session, we're going to hear the stories of four professors slash game designers, four brave souls who decided it's in fact possible and maybe even a good idea to mix this volatile combination of demanding professional roles. Four daring adventurers who looked academic tenure criteria dead in the eye and asked themselves, can I please have some game industry style crunch with that? So it's a bold proposition if there ever was one, but clearly it's also a meaningful one. After all, as game designers, aren't we all a little bit a mad scientist, eager to throw away the shackles of commercial demands in exchange for unbridled academic freedom? Which brings us to the big dramatic question that we are going to address today. Game design academia, is it living the dream or is it surviving a nightmare? Well, let's find out about that. Now, before we go there, though, it's time for introductions. Now, I'm about to start a new position at Northeastern University, but for the past 8 years, I have held a joint position between the College of Education and the Department of Emerging Technology in Design and Business at Miami University of Ohio, where a few years ago, I got my tenure, which is a key element of Miami being that it's an R2, which means that they have high research activity and tenure criteria are substantial, but they also have a significant teaching load. So my scholarship is about games and aging, and my latest project is called Brukel. It's a horror game based on the authentic memories of my, at the time, 92-year-old grandmother that is told to players in her own voice. So that's me. Our next panelist is Chris.
Hi, my name is Chris Totten. I'm an assistant professor of game design at Kent State University. I'm also the program coordinator of our animation game design, or AGD program. So I have my own indie game studio, Pie for Breakfast. My tenure home is on Kent State's Tuscarawas campus in our College of Applied and Technical Studies. And I teach classes in our program at 3 of the campuses within the Kent State system. I've done my academic stuff includes, writing books about game design and level design. I co-founded the Smithsonian American Art Museum Arcade, but I'm here to talk about my games through Pie for Breakfast. The first of which is La Mancha, which is a tabletop storytelling game based on Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote. The game was successfully funded on Kickstarter in November of 2018 and released commercially in the fall of 2019. And my studio's current project is a game called Little Nemo and the Nightmare Fiends, which is done in collaboration with another indie studio, Pixel Please, and based on the work of animation pioneer Winsor McKay. It was just funded successfully in Kickstarter back in March of this year, and is currently in development for PC and Switch.
I think I'll just jump in there.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Tracy Fullerton. I am a professor and also director emeritus of the USC Games program at the University of Southern California. Also, I hold the Electronic Arts Endowed Chair in Interactive Media. And I am the director of the Game Innovation Lab, which is my research group at USC. My tenure home, which was awarded way back in 2008, is within the Interactive Media and Games division of the School of Cinematic Arts. And so that is one of the 2 major schools at USC that make up the collaborative cross-campus USC Games program. Today I'm here to talk about my games that I've released commercially through my work at the Game Innovation Lab. So in 2017, I released Walden, a Game, which is a 6-hour-long open world translation of Henry David Thoreau's Walden, or Life in the Woods. And so this game was first released on itch.io and then on PlayStation and Steam. And by the time of this viewing should have been released on Xbox. So you can check that out. Along with my earlier game, the Night Journey, which was a collaboration with the media artist Bill Viola, These were two of the first 4 games released through the USC Games publishing label. So this is a publishing label that we have through the program that offers opportunities for students, faculty, and innovative independent designers to have their non-traditional games released to the marketplace. We think of it as, something like you would have a publishing label through a university. This is a publishing games label through our university. So I'll pass it to Dave. Looking forward to having a discussion today.
Thanks, Tracy. Hi, everybody. My name is Dave Beck. I am a full professor at the University of Wisconsin-Stout. And within the School of Art and Design, I'm the founding director for the game design program at Stout as well. I'm actually now more in the directorial role for the school, as well as upper administration. I'm actually in now a 1-year interim position as associate provost for the campus. So really looking forward to applying some of my game design background to new types of systems across the entire campus. My background is really pure art, lots of modeling, animation, world building. The 2 games I'm probably going to be talking about the most today are Tombeau. It's an interactive, essentially an interactive film that has elements of history and environmentalism focused around a river on kind of in the upper Midwest. And I spent a number of years just working on that as a solo artist and designer for the game, creating that and releasing it as that interactive experience on Steam and itch. And then I'll also hopefully talk a little bit about Distilled as well, my current project. As of right now, this presentation that you're watching, this is on Kickstarter as we speak. And I've been working on this over the last couple of years. This actually started as a project in Scotland, where I was doing quite a lot of research. Ended up deciding to create a board game. So kind of jumping between those different worlds, much like Chris had mentioned as well. So that's me. And again, I'm really excited to be here to talk with everybody today. And I'm going to hand it back to you, Bob.
Yeah, awesome. That's excellent. And as you can tell, we had a lot of fun preparing for this session and sharing our stories as academic game development journeys, obviously bind us together. And as we were sharing these, well, for lack of a better word, war stories, we quickly realized that we needed a structure to keep ourselves on track and to avoid too lengthy tangents during the session. So as we're all professors, we ended up making a diagram that Dave turned into a wonderful illustration. So as we pull that up here, in a nutshell, being an academic game developer puts you in between the field and academia. So ideally, there's a strong exchange with the field as you introduce it within the university structure and your program. And we identified these 6 key elements in doing this, which we will be used to drive our discussion today. However, before we do that, we should probably discuss the big elephant in the room. Why on earth would somebody want to do this? We could all be indie game developers making games or professors writing papers about game design and make life a bit easier on ourselves, right? So why did we decide to do this, guys?
Well, I can jump in. I'll jump in because I think I might have started pretty early. For me, one of the reasons to go to academia coming out of industry was that I had seen a model of other art forms where people had done really, truly experimental work, new genre defining work within the confines of the university, within sort of, a place where new ideas and taking risk was valuable, right? Sometimes that's not true in a purely commercial setting. And even in indie work in the arts, it's very difficult to be truly experimental. So, one of my motivations for going to academia and starting my research lab was that I wanted to make things that were outside the norms of, what you could experiment with, sort of on the edges of the game industry. I want to go into full experimentation mode. So that was one of my motivations. So I don't think I realized it would be as hard as it has been, but it was one of my core motivations for even going to USC in the first place.
Right. Yeah, I think the way it worked for me was somewhat similar, because for me it was also about I just want to be able to make the games that I want to make. I want to experiment and push things as much as I can as an artist, rather than having to be commercially dependent on whatever I end up making. And I think for me, that's the biggest, especially on tenure track, once you've got your tenure sorted out, and that's something I'm sure we'll discuss later on as well. But once that's sorted out, it gives you a lot of freedom in some extent. Maybe not. I mean, what are your experiences with that, guys?
I'm similar background. My background is in, architecture and the arts. And when I was in school, we had professors even operating their own firms within the School of Architecture and doing both industry work and academic work. So this is something that is very familiar to me. I've always thought that game development seemed like it fit neatly within a more studio art style practice where you are doing your work, creative work, and that becomes part of your validation. But then also, you do the typical work of an academic. So those are things that I wanted to find a place that would allow me to do that kind of stuff. Other points that do strike me as really important in this job too, though, is that, I think this helps me certainly with credibility in the classroom. There was a time before I was doing quite as much indie development, but maybe I was just teaching the software where somebody might be like, well, why should I listen to you? You've never published a game before. And now, with my own independent practice, the students, like, that's not even really a factor. The students will be like, well, yeah, we know that you did these things. And then again, the creative freedom aspect, frankly, in a practical sense, the academic job pays my bills. And then I don't have to rely on the commercial performance of some of my games. I can make weird experimental stuff. I can go from tabletop to video game. I mean, I'm working on a Game Boy game right now, like as a side project. And I can do that because, I can put out a broad scope of things based on just experiments I want to do.
Yeah, and I a little bit contrary to some of the responses, I kind of fell into it. I tripped and fell into a giant puddle of game design. That sounds messy, but and I guess it is kind of messy. But I decided to be actually from the beginning. I have always wanted to be teaching in higher education and being a professor. Originally thinking it was going to be more art, traditional art, sculpture was my background, but my love of technology and games just started to kind of intertwine with my interest in research. And so I went from being a sculpture instructor to a 3D modeling instructor to a game design instructor. And so my research practices followed that as well. So a little bit different, but I, like many of you have said, it's probably more complex a route than perhaps definitely more complex than others, but I wouldn't trade it for anything.
It's actually interesting, Dave, because I didn't know that about you, but like that kind of resonates with me as well. Because as being, from Europe, higher education is pretty affordable. So I just I got my master's and I'm like, well, I could get a PhD now. And I just kept going. And then I had a PhD and I was like, well, let's try for a professor position. It kind of just kept going, because I've always wanted to make games. Like ever since I was 8 years old, I've been making games. But yeah, just getting the degree, since it wasn't super expensive in Europe, that kind of put me in this position where I ended up doing this. Go ahead.
I was going to say real quick, I do want to jump on and validate the point and echo the point that you just said, where you were like, I just wanted to make games. Mm-hmm. With all the professional answers, I mean, there is a big element of this for me where it was like, no, I am making video games. Hear that, 9-year-old me? Like, we're making video games now.
Totally.
All right. Well, I think that was great to open everything. Let's look at that diagram that we were talking about and address the 6 key topics. And we decided to do this chronologically for everybody watching. So, when we start these projects, when we want that academic freedom, we need funding to start making our game though. So panelists, what's your advice regarding funding?
Oh, well, I'll start this one because it's going to probably be different than some of the others. So again, kind of falling back on that artist mode, because that's my background and what I knew, When I approached making Tombow, I actually didn't think that much about funding, which probably might have been a mistake. But what I thought about as money and funding was time. I needed time. I needed to figure out how to have dedicated time outside of teaching. So for my approach, and I say this because there might be some of you out there watching this, I actually decided to just apply for a number of artist residencies where I could essentially have a month, 2 months, 3 months, where all I'm doing, I'm in literally a cabin in the woods or some other institution somewhere else where I'm able to just focus on that. So that was one big approach that I decided to take, that obviously later I did need to find funding to support some of the vision I had, but to get it going and really for a good majority of that project was done at these residencies where all I'm doing is waking up, making work, going to bed 7 days. And it's like heaven. The idea is just heaven to me. And so, yeah, I don't regret that. I've really loved being able to take advantage of that in my projects to have nothing else outside distractions. So not necessarily a good answer to your question, but a different type of funding is time for me.
Right. Yeah. I mean, for me, it was also not necessarily like finding the big pot of money. Because at an R2, it's less research intense. So even though Miami has some support for finding grants, it's minimal in comparison to R1s. But my position at Miami did come with an endowment. So I had some money every year that I could use for creative pursuits. So that was really helpful. But for me, it was mostly applying for some internal grants like a research leave, a summer scholarship, those types of things. But when I started Bruegel, I think it was mostly a matter of like, well, I want to make this game regardless. And if I have no money to do it, I'll still make it over the weekends. In hindsight, I think one of the things that I would like to do on a future game is look for more money for it. Because in my background, when I was working in a research lab back in Belgium, before I moved to the United States, we used to go get the big pots of grants. And it was like with an entire research lab, like, okay, we're going to get a grant of $500,000 to $1 million and we make games for health. But again, even though Bruegel has a very strong educational component, I think it would be a lot harder to find that kind of money rather than, when you're doing a game for health type of project. So for me, it was very intentional, like, let's see what I can do if I have no money. And then afterwards, if that goes well, it will only get better when I start looking for games that might be more fundable. But, it's always going to be a little bit of that balance. I don't know.
I think it's also interesting to, once again, highlight a point you made. A lot of the funding does seem to be in games for something. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the points that have come up in our discussion is that sometimes these games aren't necessarily games for something. They are games and they might have some other component, but they don't necessarily fit neatly into the games for education, games for health areas. And so like myself, I've gone for, internal grants to do a few game projects. We have access to summer research scholarships. I haven't really taken advantage of any of those, but, that's something that we do at Kent State. And then, of course, there's external things. I'm in the early discussion stages of an NEH grant and things like that. But part of what we do is, I've utilized like elements of our program to also assist. So same sort of thing where it's like, you're not necessarily going for formal funding, but there are already these mechanisms in place that'll give you student help, the ability to have students get compensated for their time in the summer and things like that. And then of course, I've also done more industry-based funding, like, again, both the projects I'm talking about today are Kickstarter funded. So that does give a little bit of freedom in like the subject matter of the games, I think, sometimes.
Yeah. I think that's a really great point. And what I'm hearing resonates a lot with the early days of my project. So, I started making Walden back in 2007, right? And there was no sort of funding available for a game like Walden at that time. I will say that we had gotten funding for the Night Journey back in 2005 through the NEA, but that was through Bill Viola, and it was a media arts grant. He's a well-recognized artist. There was a whole path there for, a media artist who wanted to make a game. There was no path for a game designer who wanted to make an art game. And so we did have, early funding there for the prototype of Night Journey. But when I set out to make Walden on my own, there was nothing. I mean, I could have applied, I don't know, for some grant in sciences to make a game maybe about global warming at Walden, right? Or something like that. But that's not the game I wanted to make. Right. In fact, the team talked a lot about this. Should we go for the funding that's out there? Should we sort of turn the vision of the game in order to fit into a category of grant? We actually decided not to. And so we went without funding for the first 5 years of the project. It was all volunteer work. And we did get a really nice little like $25,000 internal USC grant, which, that's not a lot when but it paid for some things, some students and things like that. And then it was really one of the things I would advise, and this is, just happenstance, but I think it's because we're all out there doing things, is that the world changed and people there were decisions on the Supreme Court about what games are and what kind of, sort of creative speech they are. And there were, changes inside of the organizations that provide grants, right? So during the time that we were working, these grants from the NEH came, Digital Project for the Public became possible. The NEA included video games specifically in their call for media arts grants. These things began to change, right? So while things may seem hopeless when you begin, if you work hard, what we wound up having was a super articulate prototype when those opportunities arose, and we were able to apply for the NEH and the NEA grants that were coming to life during our work. And, as Dave said, that money made it possible for us to really build our vision out. I mean, if they hadn't come at that time, we probably would have finished our little game. It would have been like a lot of academic games. It would have been sort of, of a certain quality, right? But we really had a vision for a commercial game. And those grants allowed us to build that vision out and to really polish and make sure that and work with scholars and historians in a way that we couldn't otherwise. So I guess one of my advices for people, who are out there saying, oh, no one's funding games like mine, is that's okay. Keep going. Right.
Yeah. Yet. No one's funding it yet. Right.
Not yet. Exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. So let's move on to the next topic that we have to address. How does your process change when you're doing this within a university context? What is different about it? What's unique about it? So let's talk a little bit about that.
It's slow. It's slow. I mean, I come from industry, right? So, we would make these, massive games and ship them and get them out. We were always building our technology infrastructure, and our team was getting like more and more experience, right? And in academia, you have the situation where you're working with students, maybe at most they can give you 10, 15 hours a week. I mean, that's the extreme, but then they start crunching on their like capstone projects and you lose them. And then you got to train a whole new group of students every couple years. They sort of transition out. And you yourself, I mean, Dave's list of things that he's doing, I was laughing when you were saying, because I was on that track too. I was, chair, director of the whole USC Games program, blah. I was like, dying, right? Yeah. So how do you do that? And how many hours do you eke out a week to spend on your own project, right? So the whole thing has to become this extended experience that is not, I mean, obviously in industry, they work long, hard hours on games, but that's what they get to do. You are working long, hard hours on games, and you are running departments, and you are, grading and making and doing, teaching and all that stuff, right?
And that's funny you say that, Tracy, because that's exactly right. I mean, for me with Tombow, I think I took about three and a half years to make it, and I said, I'm going to do this on my own. I'm that artist mindset. I'm going solo on this. And for the most part, I did. And it took longer. But I was, chair at the time and then director for the school. And I had to literally put it on ice for 6 months, right? Deep storage. And then summer would come and I'd just furiously go. But what was interesting too, talking about process, is that for the second time around for the game I'm working on now, very different, of course, with a board game. But I knew from the beginning what I'd learned from Tomboa is I am never doing a project just on my own again. I need a team. I kind of graduated from the artist mindset, which is very much doing this on my own, to more of a developer's mindset where a team, we can accomplish things faster, better, more efficiently. But most importantly, in my perspective, we all have our different skill sets that we're bringing to the table, and it's just going to be that much better. We're all doing that much better. So yeah, I would agree. Slow. Summer is my friend. I really do focus on that. With a teaching focused school like Stout, so much of our time is dedicated to the classroom during the school year. So yeah, I echo that. I would say molasses, red tape, hoops, all those things at an institution definitely, unfortunately, infiltrate into the game development process too.
Yeah, I think, because what resonates a lot with what you just said, Dave, for me is like the solo part of it. Like I don't think I will ever be doing a game entirely by myself again, because I had a lot of roles to cover as well as a professor. And I think what I should definitely have done better is the life-work balance part of it, because it really becomes a lot. You end up doing these insane hours, and I got a burnout through it. Like I don't know if I would be divorced right now if I hadn't done all that. Even like it's been pretty rough. And I think one of the things that you want to take into account is just like, yeah, you want to make sure you get help from other people that can take certain parts out of your hands. Because even if I look at Bruegel right now, I'm like, if only I could have spent more time on the marketing, but like I already got a burnout for it, like, right? And I'm still feeling like I should have pushed harder. So I think for me personally, and I know that's a very personal thing, but like making sure that your process involves your life work balance, I think that is the thing that I should have done a lot better. Aside from that, I think for me, it was a pretty straightforward process. Like I tried to do it as much as I could, as I would have done it if I weren't a professor. But at the same time, it's something that you have to be very aware of, that you are doing 2 different jobs at the same time almost, and you need to cut yourself some slack a lot there. So I think that would be my biggest advice, or 2020 hindsight thought about doing all this.
Yeah, the way I balance it too is I try to do something for the game every day, even if that's like I make a few sprites. Having that constant progression is nice, especially with Nemo. Like we're hand animating it, right? So if I can get a few frames in, it's really helpful. And one of the things that you all mentioned, the collaborative part of it, what I like about working on teams, especially, and with my current project, I'm working with non-academics as well, and we start to keep each other kind of honest. If I go down an academic rabbit hole, they're the one that can push me back and be like, but it's gotta be good for speedrunners, something that like I'm not even thinking about. Sorry, speedrunners. But then, on the flip side, I'm the one who can also be like, well, here's how we should approach the art, and here's how this can become a study of this media. And then that becomes the thing we end up getting press for. So that collaborative element is really good. I totally agree with Bob that, something's going to fall off. For me, it was also definitely marketing. And yes, please take care of yourself. For me with 3 kids, like I can't afford not to. Right. So,
I just want to say that's what you just said, Bob, about you might not be divorced. I mean, that really touched me. My experience, I actually have never done a game, board games, but I have never done a digital game just by myself. I'm very team oriented. And I actually got sick partially, partway through the development of Walden. I had breast cancer and had to go through chemo and radiation and surgery and all those great, wonderful things. And because I had this team, I thought the game was going to stop. And it was the most wonderful thing I've ever experienced, is that they kept going. when I couldn't come in and when I just didn't have the energy, they kept going. It was actually extraordinary to experience. And that even though this was like one of the worst periods of my life, it was also really a wonderful thing to have experienced, the dedication of that team.
Wow.
Yeah, actually, now you mentioned that, because I had some students that, I had in class at the time, and some of them contributed like a 3D model left and right for the game. And, I had a lot of support from them as well. It's definitely something I should mention as well. It was heartwarming to see how much support you can get in that way while you're going through hell and back.
And I wonder if we would have received those kinds of support if we had been in a commercial or indie studio, right? So, like my dean just said, whatever you need, right?
Right.
And I think that's something specific to academia when you go through a crisis like that.
That's interesting. Yeah, and I hope that the people watching this, especially if you're on the tenure track or you're thinking about that, again, Tracy talked about advice earlier in another response, and I think that don't be afraid to reach out to others for support. I think it's so important to seek that, and don't think you have to do it just because you're going up for tenure, that you have to do this on your own. And I think we'll see less of that as games evolve, but still, I think that's important to note too.
Right. Well, let's move on to the next topic, and that one's ownership. So how did that work for you guys? Does the university take all the revenue, or do you see some return on all the time you invest into the project as well? How did that work out?
Anyone want to jump in?
So I can start. At Kent, we have a collective bargaining agreement, which says that it defines anything like this as a work, and stipulates that it is the property of the faculty member. So this is, again, one of the things that attracted me to this position in particular. I've worked for universities where that was not the case. So you would maybe try to cordon things off in a certain way, but part of our agreement, but also what has shaped the culture where I am, is that because we own the work, they actively advise us to do stuff like this, because if we're happy in creating work and then can go out and be like, I work at this great place, that is good for the university. So a piece of advice, if you are earlier in your career, I would say is, and yeah, the academic job market is what it is, but, look into those things and see what, again, ownership and things like that there might be, because that is an important part of this journey.
Yeah, I'll just chime in. It's pretty much the same at University of Wisconsin Stout. I think one asterisk to put on that, though, is that there is, at least in Wisconsin, very clear law about if a student creates something as part of a class, then they are having ownership of that. Rightly so, right? But so that's one thing that I kept all of my game development when I was working with students, if I was on any projects outside of the classroom, as its own independent entity. And then the only other thing I'd say too, and this is kind of one that I'd be curious to see what other people think about. I've always been in this weird realm of, I'm using my the computer my university has given me. I'm using the software as well. I'm making a not-for-profit game. I'm not profiting off of Tombow, but at the same time, like, that's one thing that I know has always been a little bit of a foggy area. So that's one area that I'd be curious to hear what others think about too.
Yeah. I actually don't really care about if the game is going to make any money or something. I don't need to get additional salary from it, because that's why I'm doing this in the first place. That's already covered, right? So I had hoped that the university would just want to publish it. But they were like, nope, we're not going to do that. But that means that, you get to do everything yourself, and you also get to reap the rewards for that. So I ended up setting up Lifelong Games and then published the game myself. And that worked out fairly well, I would say. But yeah, at Miami, it's a similar principle, I guess, from what you guys have been talking about. You can keep the ownership for it pretty easily. And it worked out that way. But, it all added into the surprise of how much work this was actually going to be, because now I'm also managing my own company for it. So, yeah, that was definitely a stressful thing to do when you're not expecting it.
I think this is a really topical issue, by the way, because most research universities, especially where there are grants involved, and this is true of USC, do claim ownership if there's federal grants involved, right, of research, and specifically of patentable what they call inventions, right? There's rarely any language around more copyrightable works, which is where games fall into, right? And at USC, the policy is that basically the university owns patentable works that were created through research grants, but there are traditional exceptions for works of art. And so it was unclear that the IP policy was written in, I think, 2001 or I don't even know. It's like some insane number of years ago. And in it says, exceptions for works of art. And then there's also this whole thing on software. So works of art that are software are not even considered and so we had to go through this process where we actually cleared we cleared Walden specifically as a work of art. Night Journey is obviously a work of art made by an artist, and so we went through and cleared it as a work of art, and therefore the rights are retained by me, and I include the team in that. And then what we decided to do as a team was publish it through USC Games, our publishing label, and to actually return all of the profits. I can't even call it profits, because it costs so much to make over the years that it's really not profit. But we return everything that is made by the game to the lab to fund new students and staff in the maintenance of the game, and if we ever got enough to maintain them in making new games, right? So that's our sort of ecosystem that we determined. Now we could have other artists, other game artists like Peter Brinson does something similar, but we could have just as well decided to take it out and make a company since we owned it. But we determined that it was more important to us to maintain this ecosystem at the university for innovation. So that was our choice.
Dave, you had mentioned software in particular, and I think this is one area where it's important to talk up open source software. Under my collared shirt that I wore for the presentation, the rest of the day I've been wearing my Blender shirt. Blender now has a 2D tool set, which is what we are animating Little Nemo in. So I'm very big on that. But yeah, I mean, we try to where we can adopt, we try to keep those things, again, cordoned off, so we don't fall into any of those muddy areas. But, and then whenever we do like summer internships with students, I either have them intern with Pixel Please, the other organization, or that is where Pie for Breakfast will act as a separate entity that they are taking the internship with. It's not just like a research assistantship or something like that. So trying to think about those things, it's also a good lesson for students too, because it does actually, like, if you are using free software, it does start to get into, well, this is a way to think about how to manage your own studio, because now you're like, where can I cut costs? I can cut costs by not having to pay the subscription for Maya or something like that. So it's like a little bit of studio management in there too.
That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm going to use that to segue in the next part, because one of the resources that you can use at a university are obviously students. And I think for me, because with Bruegel getting big, I had students involved as well to a lesser extent, I guess, than, it wasn't like a lab that was doing it. But I recruited some students like, hey, do you want to help out with some 3D models that I will not really have the time for making? And, in the end, I asked them, okay, in exchange for your work, do you want some compensation? Some of them wanted something, others didn't. In the end, Bruegel wasn't a big money maker, it just broke even, but I was able to give every student what they wanted in exchange for their work. So I'm pretty proud about that. But yeah, that brought some help, but also a lot of concerns as well, because even though, being able to show off Bruegel to my students and look what I made, and they're like, oh my God, that's really awesome. And talking my teaching about, and this is what happened when we did this and that in the project, or, show the project management side or the marketing side of Bruegel to help my classes. It also brought some friction with it as well. For example, I had one student that was going to program everything, but it really didn't work out. And eventually I had to just be like, look, this is not going to work. I'm just going to do this myself. And, I'll give you credit for the work that you've done, although I don't think anything actually made it to the game. But I'm like, if you want to use this in some kind of a way, the time that you invested it, I'll do whatever I can to help you out. It's still really stressful because obviously you don't want to do that. I mean, you bring a student in because you like their work and you anticipate it's all going really well. But yeah, that was a thing that makes things a little bit harder for me as well. So for our next topic, I mean, I kind of already did it myself, but like teaching students, any thoughts on that, guys?
I think if I could jump in, kind of talking about somewhat of what you mentioned, Bob, and Tracy had mentioned this a little bit earlier too. I think, sure, the sad part about working at an institution trying to develop a game is it takes a long time. It takes a lot longer. But I think one of those benefits is this symbiotic kind of incubation, at least for me, that I have, where I can bring ideas that I'm working on into the classroom when I'm teaching. That might be project management, or that might be a new type of workflow. And then I'm bringing that to test it and prove it and show to the students and teach them. But then I'm also learning stuff from their games if I'm overseeing a capstone project. So I think that's one really wonderful advantage of working within the confines of the institution, is that is a freeing thing of the institution that I think that larger commercial studios lack that ability to be so flexible and change over time. So that would be one thing I'd definitely say that I appreciate about kind of that teaching relationship with students.
Yeah, one of the things that came up when we were building that diagram, I don't know if you have the diagram up right now.
I do now.
All right. Well, I mean, you can see among all those bubbles, we have like university program students kind of huddled into one area, but then we have that big arc of arrows going into the field. And then, the rest of the arrows kind of weave their way back to the university program. That's one of the things that I think doing this has really been a benefit in the classroom, is that, people think of like teaching as this other thing sometimes. And I don't agree with that at all. I think, all of this stuff feeds itself, where if I do something in my game development, I mean, you better believe I'm going to go talk about that in the classroom and offer a perspective, whether it be in how I model my class to be like what it's like in the real world, whether I take, when I'm teaching animation theory, I mean, one of the best things was this past fall when I was making my PowerPoints, I'm like, I have a bunch of GIFs from hand-drawn animation for Little Nemo in there. Squash and stretch, okay, get sprayed a flip, put in PowerPoint. That was really great. So you can see it like actual working models, not just me showing Looney Tunes, though I love Looney Tunes. But then you can really offer perspective on what it's like. It's not theoretical anymore. It is real. And, we get to make that come alive to the students in such a way that they see what it's like to really get into the industry, instead of, again, sort of like a fiction that they're fed about what it's like getting into the industry. So I think that's a really important point, is that you can start to have real conversations about this as a job.
To build on that a little bit, Chris, also they can graduate with a shipped game. So, this is invaluable to the students, right? And so, for me, it's, what we do to solve the problem that Bob was talking about was are they a fit? Do they really have the capabilities? Is a lot of times in the beginning of the year, we basically have all the research labs present what jobs they have open. And then people come and visit our working meetings, and they sort of gravitate towards what their what they can do and what the project needs. And often if there's not a fit, they'll just fall away. And it's sort of like this thing where we have a kind of trial period before we actually hire them.
It's like an internship. It's like
it's kind of like, well, sort of they visit, they listen to us working, they say, I think I could do this. I say, why don't you give it a try? Let's see if it works out, then we hire them. Right? It's a kind of a test in a way. We also have been very lucky in getting placements of graduate research. So the university has a graduate research program, and a number of our students get research appointments, and then we can ask to have them placed in our labs. And with this kind of method, we get people who are being paid. They have a stipend, they get credits. It's actually a real appointment for them, and that's a level of commitment beyond just hourly student workers that I think has worked really well for us throughout the process.
I think, and to go back a little bit too, you were bringing up the structure of like sort of the early work, like tryout period, right? I think that's one of the things that I've learned through working with students on projects like this in our internship course is the ways in which you do have to bend your process a little bit. If I'm working with a animator who's been in the industry like 5 years or something like that, I can be like, all right, go make a run cycle, and they'll go make a run cycle. But working with the students, it's almost like, you really have to bring them in and they're entry level to junior, and you have to, I can't just say, go make a run cycle, or if I do, I might have to redo that run cycle later. But, we've gotten better about doing things like, and I'm speaking mainly as an animator right now, or artist animator. I could do something like, I do all the keyframes of the animation, and then I hand that document, the keyframes, off to the junior artist. And then I say, all right, can you do the in-betweens? And a model like that, it's a little more work for me, but the student has that baseline so that everything comes back way more coherent, where, so you do have to like change your process a little bit, but it does.
Or your design. Just to kind of, one of the things that we found is sometimes you find students with special talents, and we have put features in based on those special talents, right? And like one of our students was really great at animating hands, which we hadn't had. And so in the original design, there were no animated hands. And so we had the student, he was a graduate researcher, and he's like, let me try this, right? And so he did it, and we're like, oh my God, let's add this to the game.
That's awesome too, because their hands are not easy to animate.
Pretty good at it.
So, there's teaching is obviously a really big part of the professor game designer. But the other part is, how are you going to be evaluated by your university? Now, I realize that we're taking a lot of time to discuss all these topics, and we need to make sure that we wrap it up in the time slot. So I'm going to go a little bit off script, because our last two topics are dissemination and validation, but I feel that those are two topics that are close together so that we can kind of address them a little bit faster. So what do you guys think? How do you disseminate your games? How do you make sure that the university respects what you're doing and values it for tenure and for all sorts of performance reviews?
So as the pre-tenure person on the panel, I'm going to start off here. I'm actually in somewhat uncharted territory for my unit. So I'm kind of the guinea pig. Our program was just accredited last year, so we are, and there has not been a tenured person in my field yet. So a lot of this has had to do with contextualizing these works properly in a way that people can understand, like from other fields, what these are. Because the school at a high level is in support of this kind of work, but and I'm actually working on my tenure documentation right now. My yearly check-in thing. So I have to do a lot of extra work in my narrative, for example, to describe like what it means to publish a game. If I publish something quick, that try to contextualize that, kind of build it out to be like, well, that something quick and small, like a game jam game might be the equivalent of doing, maybe a smaller paper. Whereas, if I spend 2 years on a game, like La Mancha or like Nemo is, going to become, try to contextualize that in steps of like, well, this is like prepping a book. So you have to do a lot of explanation and working with, if you have like a faculty mentor, that's the best. We have a great mentoring program in our program. So, that's really helpful. But learning how to, I guess, describe these things is one of the biggest things that I have to do.
I think what you said about mentorship is really good. I'm glad you brought that up, Chris, because especially for those that are on the tenure track, or perhaps just getting into it, academic instructor, adjunct, finding others that have helped blaze that trail is going to be very, very helpful. Have them as allies. And I would say too, just as a kind of a somewhat of a tangent, I'm in the School of Art and Design, and so when I created Tombow, I was already tenured, but what I did was, yes, I put it up online. I did the things that many game designers and developers might do, but I also, because I was in my art and design department, I had an art exhibition. I thought that it would be a great way to demonstrate to my peers that this should be held as a work of art. So I had the game, but then I had process. I had this, people were calling it my Pinterest wall, but it was basically about 500 images, sketches, images that I put up on the wall. I 3D printed a number of my objects modeled from the game too. So kind of trying to create this overall process to help others that obviously we know it. We're surrounded by people that don't frankly understand what we do and how we do it, but it's a nice way to bring that to a level that they might understand. And I found that to be quite successful, even though it seemed like it was extraneous and I thought, I don't know if I should do this. I was very happy I did at the end because my colleagues, who would have been tenuring me if I was on the tenure track at that point, would have fully understood what I was doing as well.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah. Go ahead, Tracy.
Oh, okay. Real quick. One on the point of seeming extraneous, though, that is actually another way that you can play the game with this.
Totally. Yeah.
Is that, okay, so I made a game. Now I can publish papers about what I learned from publishing that game, how the game, again, based on 400-plus-year-old piece of literature, expresses the piece of literature and the themes within and things like that. You start to treat this as a piece of literary criticism beyond just being cool game product.
Totally.
So I think that is also a thing you learn how to do, is turn this untraditional publication into traditional publications. Mm-hmm. And you can probably get like a few years of traditional publications out of something like this. Mm-hmm. So that's another, again, it goes back all into that loop of make thing, have it feed your other traditional types of validation.
Yeah. I would agree. Sorry.
Yeah, I think for me, the same thing applied there. Like, I learned at the university, as long as I can show that people care about it in some way, whether it's through publications getting accepted or through rewards or awards or, all that kind of stuff, that helps tremendously. Or even the amount of downloads that you generate, publishing that in your tenure dossier helps a lot. So, I can resonate a lot with those things. I think the thing that I want to add, though, is like, I would love to see a category for professor-made games at like festivals and everything. Because a lot of the times with Bruegel, I had to go up against big companies and like, it still did well, it's great. But I feel like I'm always just, playing in a competition in which I'm completely overwhelmed, or I'm not at the same skill level. Let me put it that way.
That's such a funny point, Bob. I want to tell you just a little funny story. Really early on, I had submitted the Night Journey to the IGF, and they actually called me, and they're like, "Oh, we really want to honor this, blah blah blah. Would you mind if we put it in the student category?" And I was like, "Do you know who Bill Viola is?" I was like, I don't think that's appropriate at all, right? And I think what you're saying, Bob, is really interesting because we're not indies, we're not commercial, and we're not students, right? And we live in this wild land between academia and indie development, essentially, that it's a wonder we get anything made at all, right?
Right.
I just want to go back to the question of tenure and validation for just 1 second. So when I went up for tenure, there were no places to exhibit your work, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, when I went up for tenure, it was like the year before Indiecade did its first awards. Okay, so one of the things that we had to do was think about, okay, what about the grants? So we had that NEA grant, right? And that's always been in my mind, that I began to understand how when you get validation in the form of a grant, that also helps your tenure story. Mm-hmm. All the things you guys are saying. So Dave, I really resonate with what you're saying about exhibits. So I've done a lot of focus on getting the works exhibited because that tends to hold more weight than commercial sales. Though commercial sales are, nice. They're nice to put in there, but exhibits in important venues and awards are often really, whether they're supposed to be or not, they are important when people evaluate your tenure case, right? And grants. The people who voted with their money, essentially, to support the work that you're doing, really, really important.
Yeah. And you mentioned professor games in particular, Bob. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about this is that, first of all, I agree. And I also agree with the addition that, we talked about this before, where the traditional forms of validation seem to be for games for X, games for Y. We, like Tracy said, we are in this weird in-between position where we are kind of doing commercial stuff. So it's not totally for X or Y. But, maybe like my board game La Mancha had some educational aspects to it because it was based on literature. I would call Little Nemo informative, but I would also call it a commercial video game. So I think what's interesting to me about these, though, and what I think makes them great works that can be academically validated, is that we have to be a little more thoughtful in our game development. We can't just make like cool video game. We've got to make cool video game, but it's got to have this other element, whether it be we are thinking analytically about the design or using a process in a new way, or it does have some connection to, education or something like that. Where we're interpreting a classic work or something. So,
I call it what Dave described is, we call it design research.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And we frame it that way when we discuss it.
We say creative research. Yeah.
But I mean, this is what architects do. This is what graphic designers do. So I think it has both that academic element, but then what's great about this is that it also becomes commercial curiosity. We have these games have that commercial, that some novelty that gives them a little bit of an edge in the marketplace because they're interesting, because frankly, we have to feed the academic part, and then it also ends up feeding the commercial part. So I think that's worth pointing out, and also talking about in how these games are distinct and why they should be a different category.
Yeah. Well, I think we're running out of time here. So to wrap things up, because we just discussed the 6 topics, I'm going to ask for each and every one of you, and maybe in one sentence, if there is one piece of advice that you could give to whoever is watching right now, what would that piece of advice be?
I'll go first, and I said it already once, but don't be afraid to ask others for help. Bring other people to your team. It's a long process. It's a hard process. You're not an expert of everything, even though you might want to think you are, feel you need to prove it. Ask for help. It's going to be the best decision you'll make towards a future project.
I would say choose your idea carefully. Don't just do the cool game you think you want to do. Choose an idea that has some depth, that can, really be used for this academic rigor, this design research, that has the potential for funding, that has the potential for this commercial curiosity. Choose your idea very, very carefully.
I would say as an instructor, you're in an important position of power, even if, like pre-tenure people don't often feel like they have a lot of power, but, you are a valuable member of your community and valuable to your students. And I would say, these types of projects will bring a community together. Use them as a way, we talked a lot about students getting shipped products. Try to use opportunities like this that you're having to also, help your students, help other people along, try to climb that hill together, team up and accomplish amazing things, and, use this to the benefit of the education you're providing.
Right. And mine would be to build up your community around your game from day one, including the students, but also the community around your game, because you're going to need that community for your game to be validated and to get all the good things that you can have from making a commercial game as a professor. So anyways, with that, we've come to the end of our session. Again, these are only 4 viewpoints, but we hope they were very useful to you. And I'm really hoping that we're going to see more sessions like this in the future. After all, in the end, this is all about helping as many game professors as possible to be active developers, as doing so plays a key part in facilitating those 3 big arrows in that diagram, where the academic gaming landscape improves the field with high quality scholarship and capable students. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Enjoy the rest of your GDC. Bye-bye.
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 Bye.